much. Gracias. Buenos dias. Concepcion, Rengo, Uruguay, Mexico, Argentina. And thank you to our distinguished guests for, excuse me, I just need to, sorry, I've just got some technical issues here. Somehow I'm seeing the screen. I don't want my screen shared, and something's happened. Zoom meeting. Let me just see if I can minimize that. That's better. Apologies, colleagues, for that. Is yeah, we're now okay. So as I was saying, thank you for your introduction and your the wise words really of our distinguished guests in their opening remarks, especially in relation to the importance of trusts and the relationship between families, schools, and the importance of social capital, all of which are areas I will both explicitly and implicitly draw on during my presentation. And thank you to the Centre for the invitation to speak at this very important seminar, which of course is happening at a very important time during the development of Chile's and indeed the wider world's education systems. It's both an honour and a privilege to be able to share some of my ideas and experiences of working for sort of 8 or 9 years in Glasgow, but for over the last 25 years where I've been engaging in these ideas around collaboration, networks, and building leadership in a diverse range of contexts around the world. But today I want to focus on some of the lessons from the UK and an example from Chile. And at the end of the session, I think there'll be some time for questions and discussion. So next slide, please. So the agenda for today really covers four areas that I want to focus on. The first is the context. We've used the phrase challenging times, I think, in the title of the conference. We've had 18 months of the pandemic. So I want to think about a little bit about where we've been, where we are, and perhaps then where we're going. Secondly, I want to explore the idea of a network learning system and the understanding the nature of leadership and collaboration and networking that needs to be in place to develop this idea of a network learning system. Thirdly, I'm going to offer some practical examples from our research and development work in the field, which are all slightly different, but are connected by the fact that they aspire to develop this network learning system. And then finally, I'll end with some key messages or takeaways. Next slide, please. So if we think about the pandemic and where we've been, who would have predicted it? We've had multiple lockdowns and school closures across many systems, and systems have closed down and opened up at different times, at different paces, depending on where they are in the pandemic. We've seen different approaches emerge around the world in terms of virtual and blended learning. We've seen children attending school for part weeks, not at all, or alternate weeks. Some year groups attending, others not. It's been a really variegated picture around the world. There've been significant variations in how different systems and sectors have responded to the pandemic. Different approaches have been taken in different places around the world. And really, day by day, week by week, there's emerging evidence that different groups of learners are differentially affected by the pandemic. And some of the evidence in England points to 6 to 8 months so-called learning loss in elementary children in English and maths. We've got some quite strong evidence about the health and well-being, and we can see, for example, the impact on 16 to 17-year-old girls in terms of their confidence and self-esteem is a really worrying issue. We've also, and a thread that runs through this presentation that I want to sort of make at the start here, is that the pandemic has had differential effects on different groups, and it's our disadvantaged children and young people, our children from the most challenging situations, that have been most adversely affected by the pandemic. We've spoken a lot about the impact on our children and young people, but we mustn't also underestimate the impact on staff in schools and early learning centres and other education institutions. You know, the pressure, the stress that staff have been under as they've had to innovate their practices very, very quickly. You know, it's my estimation that I think the use of ICT has been probably accelerated by around about 10 years in 18 months. And in the UK, we have a phrase that says necessity is the mother of invention. Well, that's certainly been the case over the last 18 months. You know, this pandemic has touched every individual, every family in society in one way or the other, and we really mustn't underestimate that. Next slide, please. So where are we now? Well, I sit on two government advisory groups, one looking at education and children's issues generally, and the other looking at higher education and further education. And it seems to me that there's two key drivers in terms of the decision making at the moment. The first is ensuring that hospital capacity is not breached, so we don't become overrun. That hasn't happened yet in the UK, but that's one of our primary concern. And the other, I think, concern is as we move through, 18 months of this, it's clear that this isn't going away quickly. And how do we balance the social and economic and wider harms with the medical harms that are associated with the pandemic? And of course, this is an empirical question on the one hand, but it's also a political and economic question on the other. And I think it's really interesting to see how we balance the innate sort of fault line that we see between those different pressures and priorities. The third point that I would make is that we are in this race at the moment between the vaccine, and of course Chile is doing very well in terms of the percentage of the population vaccinated, and the virus, and the extent to which the virus will mutate, the extent to which we can get coverage of the vaccination across the population, and at the same time react and attempt to predict how different variants of the virus may or may not work with the vaccine. There's a lot of modelling that's going on at the moment. We're predicting a spike to peak in September. There are a number of assumptions associated with the best and worst case scenarios, and the best and worst case scenarios are quite different in the levels. So there are many unknowns relating to how the pandemic will unfold in the future. But the one thing that is certain is that there will be an ongoing uncertain climate for teachers, school leaders, local and national policymakers. So next slide, please. So my argument really starts with the fact that with this uncertainty, there comes a massive opportunity. And at the moment, the window for that opportunity is open. Okay, it's probably the one positive, or one of the largest positives associated with the pandemic. However, that window will not stay open forever. It's likely to close as different forces and priorities perhaps retreat into their positions. So I think we have possibly an unprecedented situation whereby the rethinking and reframing of three key dimensions can support the development of a more equitable education system in our different countries. And those three dimensions really are the rethinking of leadership, the rethinking of collaboration and networking. And they are the issues that I want to talk about. So as we move through. So if we first think about future leadership, collaboration and networking. So from a professional learning point of view, access to education through the use of technology, to assessment systems, to the awarding of qualifications. The pandemic has stress tested education systems at every level, in every area. And my view is that many education systems, whilst they have responded at a personal level in terms of teachers and school leaders, the systems themselves have been found sadly wanting. So the current arrangements, I would argue, are no longer fit for purpose. And in many systems, as I've already said, but I want to emphasize, the most disadvantaged children and young people have been disadvantaged further, while our most advantaged young people have often had access to better resources and opportunities. So for in the UK, for example, there's evidence that the private sector in education responded more quickly and positively to the first lockdown than some of their state sector counterparts. And I would go on to argue that in order to reboot our education systems, we need a rethinking of leadership, networking and collaboration that can stimulate new ways of working, that can inspire innovation and also monitor the impact of that innovation. Put simply, colleagues, we require ways of working that change the way we do things and the way that we move knowledge, expertise and ideas around the system faster and more consistently than we have managed in the past. So let's think about the past. Let's take leadership and move on to the next slide. I mean, I don't know whether this diagram resonates with a South American audience. It certainly resonates with a Western European audience. You know, we have the leadership of the past, often centrally managed, often through top-down prescription. We have a culture of leadership that is underpinned by status and power, with power belonging to position rather than the individual. So we've tended to have, across our education systems, a pretty hierarchical and bureaucratic form of leadership that is underpinned by transactions, actually. So also transaction. And of course, the idea is the lower you are down the hierarchy, or perhaps one might argue, although I wouldn't see it in that way, the closer you are to classrooms, the more of the white stuff lands on your shoulders, as in the diagram. So from the leader at the top of the tree, we move to executives and departments, and then the rest of us that are implementing other people's wishes and having to respond to their commands. Now, if we move on to the next slide and begin to think about the leadership of the future, if we really believe in a networked and integrated and a collaborative sector, we need a different type of leadership. Our leadership needs rethinking. And I would argue that the development of what's known in the literature as reticulists is a way that we might look. So if we think about the sort of the characteristics of the sort of leadership of the future, we need leaders that are skilled communicators, that can adapt their language, that they can empathize with others through negotiation and seeing the situation from a wide range of perspectives. It's not my way or the highway. It's actually drawing out and adapting and communicating. We need leaders that are excellent networkers, one of the themes of our conference today. We need leaders that can gain access to a range of settings, and they can seek out and connect to those who have similar interests, ideas and beliefs. We need leaders that can work in different environments. They find it they have the capacity to perhaps interact with the ministry, to work with families and communities, to work with school districts, to empathise with how teachers are feeling and working, you know, in classrooms, and the pressures and the challenges that they're facing. We need to develop a set of leaders that are strategic in their orientation. They can see the big picture, and they can understand the different contributions that different partners make. Not everybody can do everything. People have different sets of knowledge, expertise, skills, experiences, and these leaders can optimize the use of drawing in these people for their different contributions. We need leaders that are contextually astute. These reticulists understand the relationship between organizational conditions, so the culture, the structures and the processes that work within the organizations, and individuals' behaviors, values, outcomes, belief systems. So they have to understand their context. We need problem solving. We need our leaders to be problem solvers. They need to be able to think laterally and creatively to seek solutions. And then finally, these leaders need to be self-starters as well as collaborative. They need to be self-managing. They take risks, but because they understand the organizational capacity, they take risks within a framework, so they can innovate and risk take without being reckless. Okay, they're certainly not maverick. They can work within frameworks. So this is a very different form of leadership to the leadership of the past. So if we move on to the next slide and start thinking about how we might enhance collaboration and networking in this new world. Well, we can think about collaboration at different levels. We can think about collaboration perhaps at the lowest level in terms of association, which would be a traditional pattern of working where you have incidental meetings, often initiated through the hierarchy. There's very little knowledge of sharing of knowledge or resources. Sometimes, you know, I'm sure you've sat in them. You know, you sat in meetings, and sometimes you're not even really sure why you're there. You know, this is the lowest form of collaboration. I think it was Edmund who spoke about genuine collaboration. I think as you move through this escalator or hierarchy of collaboration, you can see how the view and the values change. So you can think about collaboration as cooperation, where you have short-term task-focused activity, often around working groups, often around a specific issue or task. And this tends to generate some incidental sharing of knowledge or resources, often the development of resources on specific issues. At the third level, we can think about collaboration, which is a more sustainable way of working. Perhaps this is the genuine collaboration, which is underpinned by a common set of values and a commitment to share knowledge, resources and practice, with perhaps some development of new practices. But this is mostly about sharing. And of course, you know, not only do we need to share the best or the most instructive practice that exists in the system and move existing knowledge around, we also have to create new knowledge. So the idea of what in the literature David Hargreaves and pastors talked about joint practice development, working with colleagues, not only to move knowledge and practice around systems, but also to develop new practices. And you'll see that's a key feature of where I think we should be moving. And then at the top of the escalator, we can think about collaboration as collegiality, a long-term commitment to, and a shared enterprise, which is underpinned by a shared long-term vision and a set of common values which focus on sharing and developing new knowledge, resources and practice. And of course, in order to get to that stage, this is where relational trust that was mentioned at the beginning of the seminar is so important. Without developing the relational trust and having the right conditions in place, it's very, very difficult to establish long-term collegiality that will take us to that next level. If we move on to the next slide, please. Collaboration can be seen as a bit of a panacea. It's certainly a buzzword. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, it's gained a lot of traction, and it's very well enshrined in the educational and business literature. But of course, there is a dark side to collaboration. You know, you can have the illusion of association. So you can have where people are there in body but not mind. So they're at the table, but they're not really engaging. They're a sleeping partner. You can have fabricated cooperation where people are there pursuing their own agenda, often at the expense of others. We can all think about the clamour for resources between departments or schools in a district. You know, that's not really collaborative endeavour, is it? If all you're doing is seeking to build your castle or your empire bigger and stronger. There has to be some reciprocity and some mutual exchange of resources. You can collaborate with the enemy, so you can engage in a collaborative exercise in an attempt to control or limit damage, but this often turns into collusion, and you become trapped by the narrative and the discourse, and eventually taken in by it. And then perhaps, I think, is the most dangerous form of the dark side of collaboration is that of contrived collegiality, where we have false public expressions of values and belief systems, which are particularly prevalent where there are unequal power relationships. But the behaviours don't follow the rhetoric. So where our leaders say one thing, but actually they behave in a very different way. These are, and I think this dark side of the collaboration, it's really important to keep that in our minds if we are to develop, you know, this genuine or authentic form of collaboration and collegiality that we're seeking. So if you move on to the next slide, please, and we'll begin to move into some examples in a minute. But I just want to reinforce some of those key messages so far. The pandemic, as I've said, has stress-tested education systems at every level. Current arrangements have been found wanting. We do require a rethinking of leadership, collaboration, and networking. And if we are to develop or support the development of a more equitable education system, I'm proposing that we ought to be thinking in terms of developing networked learning systems. So let's just think about networked learning systems for a few minutes. If we go onto the next slides, you know, what is a networked learning system? Well, a networked learning system is a research practice partnership. So it brings together actors, people, leaders, teachers, educators, and others from different backgrounds. It's connected through networks across different types of boundaries. Okay, these might be physical boundaries, such as classrooms or organizations or geographical boundaries, or they may be professional boundaries, such as phases of schooling or different sectors working together, or it may be different curricular areas. But the key thing is that you are bringing different types of people from different backgrounds together to engage in collaborative activity that is driven by design-based research and collaborative inquiry that innovates and it tests and refines practice and builds leadership capacity through practice-based professional learning. Okay, so this is using collaborative inquiry, collaborative action research to generate evidence of what's working well, what's not working so well, and making adaptations to practice as you go. The idea is that you take risks and you innovate. And of course, if you take risks and you innovate, some things are going to go really well and have a positive impact. Other things are likely not to go so well. And that's okay. But what we need to ensure through the collection of evidence into our practice is that we learn to fail fast, so we can adapt and make changes to the new practices when they seem to be having a less positive effect quickly. So that's what we mean by a network learning system. So just next slide, please. And I want to emphasize the idea of working across spaces within organizations, within institutions, across institutions, between institutions, and then beyond institutions. And again, this is where we think about how schools and educational establishments connect into different sectors, into the families and communities, so you can leverage all the support and all the resource that exists out there. Schools cannot do this by themselves. And in a post-pandemic situation, they're even less likely to be able to do it by themselves than they thought they could before the pandemic. Next slide, please. I used the phrase design-based research, and really what we're talking about here is blurring the boundaries between research and practice. So we're bringing together different types of expertise, so undertaking a deep analysis of the context of the problems by researchers and practitioners together. We're developing solutions that are informed by the existing design principles in place. And then we're creating iterative cycles of testing and refinement, that collaborative inquiry that I spoke about, of developing and testing the impact of changes to practice, and then making decisions based on the evidence that we're generating that reflect and redesign our practices to enhance what's happening in, whether it be our classrooms, our schools, our school districts, or even our national system. So design-based research is fundamental to this, and it's key to the examples that I will talk about. If we can just have the next slide, please. So there are some key principles that occur here, and these are born out of our research over the certainly the last 8 years, but also much longer than that. So the fact that learning is primarily a social process. If you don't have the relationships in place, if the trust isn't there, authentic collaboration and networking is very difficult. This has to be a generous activity where it's believed that all can learn and achieve, irrespective of where they start. The exception that variation is the norm is really important. Learning has to be outcome focused. So we have innovation and improvement at the core of what we do. This isn't collaboration for collaboration's sake, to make us feel good. The idea is that we develop the trust and the relationships to be able to have challenging conversations, challenging professional conversations with each other. Learning occurs at all levels. Everybody has something to learn. And that means that there's a mutual dimension to this. This isn't about the transmission of ideas or evidence. It means we have to respect each other and value different types of knowledge and expertise. It's underpinned by our design-based research, our systematic collective inquiry. So inquiry and evidence is key. And it takes a critical and action-orientated stance. Critical perspectives are really important and we have to challenge what we're doing. Before we move into the examples, next slide, please. Just one final point about the broader characteristics of a network learning system. The network learning system uses the principles of network learning to drive equitable improvement. As I've said, evidence is key to identifying the challenges. We have to understand the context. We have to promote experimentation and innovation. But as I've said, we have to monitor the developments and the impact of these changes and fail fast. Planning for collaboration encompasses the development of arrangements to support long-term collaboration, that aspiration of collegiality and new approaches to capacity building. Strategic improvement, planning in schools, districts, universities is explicitly linked to our network learning activity. We actively promote both formal and informal opportunities for distribution of leadership. So this creates, the network learning system creates a virtuous cycle of building leadership capacity within the system. And different types of knowledge, as I've said, and expertise are valued and used to support these developments. Okay, so hopefully that's given you so far a flavour of the context of the pandemic, and then an insight into some of the ideas and some of the principles and characteristics associated with a network learning system. So we've gone through the first and the second part of what I wanted to achieve on the agenda today. And I now want to move on to some examples of practice. And I've got 4 examples of practice. There are 3 on the Spanish slide, but I want to talk about 4. The first 2 are Scottish education examples. The first one is about a citywide network system, and the second one's about a regional network learning system. And these are both live, ongoing, real projects with real teachers, real students, and university staff, researchers, district officers, school leaders, and teachers all working together around the shared vision of developing a network learning system. The third example, I'm going to talk briefly about research teams, which was a university school network learning system in Chile, with a focus on initial teacher education. And then the fourth example, and I'm just going to give you an overview, is really about the family and the community and the beyond school. So looking at a holistic place-based network learning system that looks beyond education. So the first 2 are really about schools and early learning centres. The second one is about a university school research practice partnership with a focus on initial teacher education and student teachers, and working with faculty, staff and teachers in schools. And then the third one is about working with a diverse range of actors from the public sector, the third sector charities, and in some cases the private sector. So let's have a look at Dundee. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is a network learning system that involves over 50 institutions in Dundee City, which is a city in the on the east side of Scotland, with quite high levels of deprivation. Its overarching vision is to build on an initial pilot of 2 years' work with 14 schools, and the ambition is to create a high-performing network learning system that's driven by school leaders and teachers. So putting those closest to the children and young people, closest to where the decision making is being made. And using differences within the system, because we know within the city there are variations in practice and achievement and performance and so forth, but using this as a stimulus for building on the good work that's doing, as a catalyst for moving knowledge, ideas and expertise across the city, and developing new practices at the same time through this idea of joint practice development through collaborative inquiry. What's really important, as we've set out on this work, particularly during the pandemic, which has raised a number of issues. We've sort of launched the second phase of this work, beyond the pilot in a virtual world, which brings with it its problems. But we've worked really hard on the language and the symbols. So we've been very clear, working with the Director of Education for the city and some of the national agency, that this is core business for us all. It's actually laid out in Dundee's existing plan for education. So this isn't a bolt-on or an add-on or an additional piece of work. This is it. This is the core mission. Can we have the next slide, please? And as I said, language and symbols are really important. And through our analysis of context, with a range of stakeholders in schools, early learning centres, local government, and the community, we've identified 3 key priorities, and this is becoming the mantra. These are the 3 key areas that underpin our strategy. So it's about presence. It's about ensuring that all pupils attend regularly and promptly. So if the children aren't in school or engaged in a virtual learning experience, then they can't achieve. So presence is key. and we found that as to be one of the concerns. You can be there in body, but not in mind. So participation, so creating a climate where schools and all pupils, this is about equity, all pupils feel welcome and valued. So where are those children and young people that are marginalized, that are invisible? We did some work years ago now where we followed some individual pupils through their day at a school, and there were some pupils who went through the whole day when a teacher didn't even use their name. Now, how does that make that invisible child feel? Where teachers, some pupils, only had very minimal interactions with their teachers during a whole school day. So once we have presence, once we have participation, the focus is on progress. So that's about developing policies and practices, bringing the different types of knowledge and expertise together, including the children and young people, to develop policies and practices that maximise the achievement and ambitions, again, of all pupils. Every Dundee learner matters. This isn't about ensuring that some people achieve. This is about trying to support the development of a more equitable education system. Okay, so what does it look like in practice? As I said, it builds on 2 years' work with 14 schools. It involves all schools and early years centre. We have a university and head teacher steering group. So it really is about head teachers in particular taking the lead rather than head teachers being told what to do by the district or national mandate. We've arranged the schools in groups that are deliberately diverse, of 3 or 4 institutions. So they're in school improvement partnerships, and they have a named researcher and district officer who provides support, external critical friendship for their activity. The process is in train, so we continue to undertake our deep analysis of context, so that those priorities came from stakeholder interviews, but we continually are looking at the current situation and how it's evolving, particularly in light of the pandemic. We have collaborative action research being undertaken in individual schools and across partnerships related to the 3 Ps of presence, participation and progress. There are 2 school improvement partnership meetings per term, and then ongoing support from the district officer and the named researcher in between those. There's a professional learning programme of masterclasses for teachers across the city, which are led by university staff and leading practitioners. And we have an annual seminar of leadership seminars aimed directly at school principals and managers of early learning centres and district officers, because remember the philosophy of everybody has to learn at every level. And we have an annual learning festival to share the ideas, knowledge, and make connections across the school improvement partnerships. And of course, most importantly, to celebrate the successes of what's been happening. And that's really important, because if you celebrate the success, it makes people feel good about what they're doing. It builds trust, it builds confidence, and it builds buy-in, all of which, of course, are essential features of effective collaboration. So what are the key lessons to date? If we move on to the next slide, well, the meaningful use of data and evidence is really important, and it goes back to building confidence. If you have the evidence there, you build confidence in the approach that's being taken and the fact that it's adding value. What's been really interesting to the team is that despite the stress and pressure that staff have been under as they've responded to the pandemic in so many different ways, they're really keen to engage in issues about their core business of improving learning for children in this new context, rather than constantly having to respond to issues that are raised by COVID. That's not to say that those issues aren't important, but why do teachers teach? Well, actually because they love the interaction with children and young people for the most part, and they're passionate about their practice and what they do. And what our network learning system in Dundee is doing is giving them a hook to hook that on. Our virtual professional learning sessions have been really important in maintaining momentum. As it was said at the outset, the return to face-to-face is really important. It's sadly missed, particularly in the early stages of building a collaborative endeavour like this, when the focus has to be on building trust and relationships before you begin to embed and extend the activity. And in our virtual environment, as I've said, these symbols and these mantras have been really important in building confidence and buy-in from leaders and the staff. So if you're thinking about doing this sort of thing, do think about the language that you use and the symbols and the messaging that you're giving. And perhaps most excitingly for me and for the team, we're seeing is a shifting of ownership of change. This is teacher and principal-led. And they're beginning to set the agenda. So what we're doing is reshaping, reframing the roles and responsibilities and the contributions of the district. So rather than the district doing things to or mandating, the district is now facilitating, brokering, connecting, and supporting schools to improve themselves. So the language we use, that it's schools' jobs to improve themselves, and it's the district's job to facilitate and make sure that it happens, which is a different way of doing things and quite a step change for us. So there's some key lessons from the first example. Let's talk about the next example. So next slide, please. The West Partnership. So the West Partnership involves 8 school districts across the west of Scotland in what is known as a Regional Improvement Collaborative, which was established in 2017. The West Partnership is arguably the largest in terms of population density, size and power in Scotland. It contains 35% of Scotland's children. There's a high concentration of children from high poverty backgrounds within the districts, but the partnership also contains some of the most advantaged children in Scotland as well. So again, what we're seeing is variation is the norm, and there's a variation in the performance of the districts. There's a variation in their capacity to support themselves and engage themselves because of the differences in size. Some are geographically huge, but very rural. Others are much smaller, but with high concentrations of urban poverty in. And our network learning system has really developed since the inception, where myself and a colleague, Graham Donaldson, worked with the then lead of the Regional Improvement Collaborative to design what we called a network, to design learning networks within the collaborative. They've now evolved, and we're thinking about the network learning system as a whole. So Graham and myself provided critical friendship and support for the director and the support for the development of the vision. And we were bringing together 8 individual local authorities with different political leadership in local government, who were used to working individually to support the development of the schools within their local authority. So it was a really sort of complex job to build the trust and the relationships across those boundaries. We're now in a massively different place to where we were at the start, where each of the directors in the 8 local authorities can see the added value of working collaboratively. And we have this phrase, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. When, for the most part, when teachers, school leaders, district officials see something working and making a difference, again, that generates the commitment and the confidence to do more of it. In addition to our sort of strategic support, we have a team that provides support to build the network learning system as it is now, through networking and collaboration and collaborative inquiry and design, using our design-based research approach. And we have a separate evaluator who is undertaking an evaluation of the process and impact. And what you see up on the slide, I won't run through them, is the finding from the first round of evaluation that we did, and I'm sure you've had a chance to read through them. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I've talked about the shift from a learning system to a network learning system. The vision at the outset was always to be thinking in terms of a holistic learning system, but actually the learning system ended up really as a work stream, thinking about collaborative action research through some professional learning networks, rather than an approach and a stance, a way of being that permeated all the activity of the West Partnership. We're now moving to that, so we no longer have a work stream that is focused on network learning or the learning system. We have that, an underpinning approach, and people are developing the idea and the shared understanding around what a network learning system could be. This has involved to re-clarify as personnel have changed over the last 3 or so years, roles and responsibilities for the next phase of development. We're really interested in how we can achieve economies of scale, get more bang for our bucks, while still recognizing the huge variations in context that exist within the system. There's more work to be done in terms of penetrating different levels of the system. I think at district level and maybe head teacher level and sometimes subject area level, we are having a good impact, but that needs to be spread further and penetrate deeper down into classrooms. There's a big focus on developing sustainable practices in these difficult times, and learning across authorities, as different authorities have different ways of doing things in response to the pandemic. One of the big, I think, successes is the West OS, which is the West Online School, which is a video bank of sort of model lessons, if you will, taught by experienced teachers, which then teachers can use as teaching aids in their teaching. So there's not a reinventing of the wheel, and they're used as a resource rather than as a video to watch. So they're used as a resource to support learning and interaction rather than being used passively, which I think is really exciting. And we're certainly supporting West to think about how they develop practices across not only West, but also influence nationally. So, for example, one of the things that our research team did was produce practice briefs on lessons from elsewhere, which fed into the West Partnership. So one of them that springs to mind, for example, was the reopening of schools in Denmark. So West sort of learned, because Denmark reopened their schools before Scotland. So we learned from what the Danish did. Okay, let's move on to the third example before we move to our final example and think about some of the key lessons that sort of permeate through these examples. So the research teams is a university-led initiative supported by Chilean Ministry for Education. There's been 2 cohorts involved in this research teams project, each lasting a year over a 3-year period. The aim of the program is to strengthen initial teacher education by developing professional capacity around teacher leadership and professional learning. It involves initial teacher education staff from the university, faculty staff, school teachers, and pre-service teachers, forming research teams that design and implement and conduct collaborative research on school-based, so this is the co-construction again, problems of practice. So you can see how each of these programs of work that I'm talking about have these common features, which are common to the network learning system. Okay, next slide, please. So if we think about sort of cohort 1 in March 2020, involved 6 research teams of 24 participants, and they were all selected after preparing a proposal for the research project, which involved bi-weekly meetings, regular seminars, monthly meetings, and ongoing check-ins from an external facilitator who supported them through the process. So remember, this is faculty staff from the university, this is school staff and its students. Okay, so if we think about, go back to the leadership model, think about we're breaking down hierarchies here. We're bringing in different people with different experiences, different levels, and different types of expertise, from pre-service teacher to experienced teacher to university faculty staff, all having to work together in collaboratively in a new space. And I think what's really interesting about the research team's process is that this is one of the few things that continued, and I'll talk about a bit more about that in a minute, during the pandemic. And this is probably because of the value that the participants got from the regular meetings within the research team, discuss their work and their research project. The second cohort has started last week and has 3 research teams of 18 participants who will be working over the next period. So next slide, please. If we just pull out some of the lessons, and here we have some Chilean teachers who were out delivering food actually during the pandemic. And as I said, this collaboration was one of the few activities that was sustained during lockdown, and the importance of maintaining connected and working together to fight isolation during very challenging times shouldn't be underestimated. And the value that these teachers and different faculty staff and students placed on exploring ideas and new ways of working was fascinating, and links back to the point perhaps about the Dundee project. If we think 7,000 miles away, you've got groups of teachers working together in the lockdown in Scotland. And what is it they want to do? They want to talk about their core business. Yes, the pandemic and COVID has to be dealt with, but they want to get back to their core business. And then the final thing that I'll say about the research teams is that the publications from cohort 1 are in process. Many have been submitted for peer-reviewed publication, and this will document the learning and the knowledge generated from the research teams in both academic and practitioner journals. We've already had one article published in a peer-reviewed journal. So there's something really important about capturing this knowledge and it being there and available and accessible for others to learn from and to use. And of course, what it does, it puts Chile as a country, as one of the leading lights in developing some of these ideas around networked learning systems. So next slide, please. We move on to my 4th and final example. So we've had 2 essentially school-based learning educational examples, one across a city, one across a region. We've had an example from Chile looking at working across professional boundaries with the aim of strengthening ITE. And now the 4th example is Children's Neighbourhood Scotland, which is a distinctive approach to improving outcomes for children and young people in neighbourhoods with high levels of poverty. It's neighbourhood-based, it's place-based, and focuses on the empowerment of children, young people, and communities at its core. It also thinks about service design and delivery. Who does it involve? Well, again, it works across different professional boundaries. So it involves the University of Glasgow, Robert Owen Centre for Educational Change, working in partnership with the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, who are population health experts, and a wide range of other partners, local authorities, health and social care partnerships, communities, and the voluntary sector. We have 6 sites, and each site has a local coordinator per site, which is part funded through funding from the Scottish Government and part funded by the locality. So there's investment from the locality as well as central government into this, and each site has access to the research and wider developmental team, and we have a national programme director, and I lead it from within the university. As I said, there are 6 sites, 4 of which are urban, One is small town and one is rural. We're really interested in what travels and what is specific to particular contexts. Next slide, please. You can divide the activity really into two strands. So there's a developmental strand of activity which increases the agency of young people by working with them as co-researchers to identify the issues that are important to them. And then feeding the learning from their research into the system, both locally and nationally. There's a developmental strand of activity around collective impact, which feeds the issues from the research of the children and young people, as I said, to inform the local and national policy to try and make things more joined up, less siloed, so that different services, for example, are working to mutually reinforce each other, so you get more bang for your bucks. And then there is a research strand of activity where we draw in research from our external networks. We undertake our own research and the analysis of context and our own design-based research program, including an evaluation of processes and impact. A sort of a very practical example of how we flexed our research during COVID was by producing both practice and policy briefs for local government and national government. So this is the blurring of boundaries, as you see in all of the programs that I've discussed, between research and practice, drawing in different perspectives, different types of expertise and experience to create and innovate and do something new. And in this case, taking a very place-based approach, working with families and communities rather than focusing more tightly on professional learning and how that can translate to impact on teaching practice and ultimately impact the outcomes of the children and young people in receipt of the new teaching practices. This is really about creating the broader conditions that allow people, children and young people from highly disadvantaged backgrounds, to have a greater sense of agency and be more involved in the decision-making process, whilst trying to think about service design and delivery. So just next slide, please. So just a few words and practical examples around our children as co-researchers. You can read the slide, but one example would be that recently children in our rural site identified feeling safe in their neighbourhood as a key concern to them. This led to a series of consultations with the community police officer to explore ways in which the children can work with the police to make the locality a safer and more welcoming place for young people. A very concrete, practical example led by those children and researchers. Other examples include where our researchers have used theatre and art to express and communicate their ideas and concerns in one of our urban sites. And I've also identified sort of life expectancy and healthy living as a key issue, and this sort of led to work around healthy lifestyles and healthy eating, living, for example. And they're currently our researchers at both primary, elementary, and secondary school are producing a video across the 6 sites that highlights what the key issues for children and young people growing up in the pandemic are, and what they think might be done about them. So there are my 4 examples, and if we can have the next slide, please. And the key lessons really from the final children's neighbourhood examples really has crystallised the fact that COVID has disrupted our most vulnerable communities the most. It's also highlighted the huge efforts by teachers, public and the third sector workers to support children and families, often at a personal cost, both financially and sometimes emotionally and sometimes health. It's also highlighted big silences in children and young people's voice and agency, particularly in high poverty areas. Sometimes it's whilst the system might be looking to do quite well around issues of children and young people's voice and agency, it's the same voices that are being heard the whole time. We're trying to find the areas where there are silences, particularly in high poverty areas, and there's a strong appetite for children in these areas to be engaged in these decision-making processes. And then finally, the interconnectedness of services. The evidence is just stark in the data that we collected, is that it's becoming and will continue to become more important than ever. So this holistic place-based approach, I think, is really important. And we're now sort of coming up to the hour mark, which is what I was asked to speak for. So I'm just going to move on to the final slide, which is an attempt just to highlight some of the key messages I've spoken about, and then perhaps we can have a conversation, or we can take some questions. So the key messages. If we go back to the beginning, the pandemic really has stress tested our education systems, and they've been found sadly lacking. But with these challenges comes this window of opportunity that I spoke about to rethink leadership, collaboration, and networking across our education systems. And the evidence that is emerging from the programme of work within the Robert Owen Centre over the last 8 years, and more widely beforehand in our own work, but also in work in Chile and North America and Australasia and other parts of the world, suggests that new ways of working can support the development of these network learning systems. And there are emergent examples that gives us hope and demonstrate that this is possible in education. And now is the time for us to think really seriously about the practices of the past and the practices of the future, and how we begin to embed and spread this way of working across our classrooms, our schools, our early learning centres, our communities, and throughout the public sector and beyond. And of course, that means that schools and educationalists can't do this on their own. Yes, they are a key part of the machine. We are key parts of the machine. I'm a biology teacher by trade, but we need to connect to wider services. We need to harness that energy, those resources that exists out with the education system, but can really make a difference to the lives, opportunities, hopes and aspirations of our children and young people. And in a post-pandemic world, this will become a more important issue than ever before. If we are truly to create more equitable education systems and ultimately more equitable and fairer societies, we're all in this together. Any one sector cannot achieve this. And this is where we've been going so sadly wrong for such a long time. And then I will end on the final note, of course, that is highlighted in some of those slides from the fourth example, that if we are to be successful in the pursuit of a more equitable society, we have to build a future for all of our children, not a selected few. And that means growing economic well-being in our young people from a very young age. And that means involving, economic and social well-being. And that means involving our young people in the design and the development of these new ways of working. No one sector can do it alone. And even if we have the collective will of different sectors and services, without the engagement of the people that we're there to serve and to support, we won't be able to achieve our aspirations. So just the final slide, please. I'm going to draw what I've had to say to a close. I've really enjoyed the last hour, and it's certainly helped me to think through some of the issues. I hope there's some nuggets in what I've said that you can take away with you. I look forward to engaging with you in questions and in the panel, and hopefully we can have a good debate. Much of what I've said has been undertaken by the Robert Owen Centre in the last 8 years, is documented in the new book that Mel and I have edited. It involves the full range of the work of the centre and some of the projects that I've spoken about. Michael Fulham very kindly wrote the forward for us. If you have any further interest or would like any further information, they're in English, sadly, but there's a Children's Neighbourhood Scotland website. So if you Google that, then there are some resources, again, sadly in English at the moment only, but there are resources and publications and frameworks and practical tools and so forth on that website. And we also have a network for the social and educational equity, which is the programme of work that Dundee and the West Partnership belong to. And my email address is there if you would like to get in touch. But thank you very much for your engagement, and I've really enjoyed working with you so far this morning. Many thanks.
Muchas gracias, Christopher, por...
Thank you very much, Chris, for this wonderful presentation. I took some notes, and it was really interesting when you talked about the research based on design, when you talked about the importance of celebrating the accomplishments, but the main axis of your presentation about the learning systems in networks, it's really interesting to see which could be the first steps. There's been a very active participation from the attendees. We got greetings from Guatemala, from Honduras. So thank you very much to all of you that are joining us. And I want to thank Chris for his presentation. We have a few minutes to gather a few questions, Christopher, and I would like to ask you one first question, and is, what do you mean when you point out that the leader of the future has to be contextually astute? Could you go deeper into that concept when you say that the leader of the future has to be contextually astute? Tell us a little bit more about that, and let's see if we can make one or two more questions.
Yeah, by all means, thanks for that question. But by contextually astute, I mean, our leaders have to have a really nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the context within which they're working, and the nature and the type of interactions that exist between individuals, teams, and how they interact with the wider environment. So it's really about having an incredibly deep